I'm just going to start with a little anecdote. I don't actually think it's true, but I sort of Googled for background information and none's forthcoming. But it's a lovely little story, even if it isn't true. It is said that in the 18th century, when the British Empire was colonising what became Canada in the area that was British Columbia, they met one of the local tribal chiefs to negotiate the fact that he was now a subject of Her Majesty, His Majesty probably at the time, Georgian times. I think their idea of negotiating was probably more along these lines. But the British Columbian chief, this is a real living British Columbian chief, but that's just to make a good picture. He turned round to the leader of the British troops and says, "If you own this land, tell me the stories of this land," which of course was a bit beyond the remit of the colonel or the brigadier or whoever it was that we're dealing with. But I rather felt myself in exactly the same position about 18 months ago when I had the very good fortune to, without planning to end up living in Avebury village, in the only house on the Henge bank, just to add a little bit of oomph to it. I'd been visiting Avebury many times, and latter years quite frequently, but starting in about 1980. So I thought I knew a little bit about Avebury. When I turned up there, and you suddenly realise, actually, I don't know the stories of this land. Now, of course, there are a great many stories, a great many narratives. These are the sort of narratives that I was probably most familiar with at the time, the sort of narratives put together by archaeologists. They may not think of them as stories as such, although I think the best of those, like Josh Pollard and so forth, Mark Gillings, would fully accept that point. Very technical narratives here. But it wasn't quite the sort of stories that I had in mind. They're informative, but not the sort of story that the British Columbian chief would recognise. So I began to sort of put together what I thought might be plausible to say about the stories of Avebury and the associated area. As Hugh has said, it's all about a book, but then again, I suspect that many of the speakers at Megalithomania are also busily promoting their latest book as well. It's about Avebury. It's about that big Neolithic landscape that became part of the World Heritage Site, which extends several miles in each direction away from the Henge itself. But my focus of interest was very specifically on this place. This is the source of the river, or the start of the River Kennet. Some of you know Swallowhead Springs, which is just off these stepping stones. If you're trying to get your directions, that's London. Due east, about 120 miles, it has to be said. Nominally, stepping stones mark where the water from the Winterbourne is flowing down from stage this left, meeting the water from Swallowhead Springs here, and this is officially the start of the River Kennet. Same water as the Winterbourne, but it changes its name when it turns direction, flowing due east. Get your bearings a little bit better. Here's Avebury, here's London, and I think most of you are familiar with the fact that the Kennet flows down to Reading, where it joins the upper reaches of the Thames, which are in the Cotswolds, and then obviously I think most of you will be familiar with the geography of the Thames through the London Basin and so forth. But essentially the Kennet and the Thames make the most consistently east-flowing river in southern Britain. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that is something which would have been respected. The confluence at Reading, if you want to visit it, it's quite easy. You can park there. It's now Tesco's car park. But you'll be well aware that the Thames at that point is a much bigger river than the Kennet. But my thinking, for the purpose of this talk, is really that the lower reaches of the Thames and the Kennet as effectively one river system. Were I sort of doing that sort of journey from the Thames estuary back up to what's now Avebury, any time from sort of 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, that is the sort of river system. The black dots are Mesolithic sites, usually occupation sites, little hunting camps and so forth. You see, rather interestingly, they do associate it with the Kennet part of the valley, genuinely are missing from, or at least not known, and this is perhaps more accurate, not known in the Cotswolds area. So this is a key river system from approximately 10,000 years ago. What were the Mesolithic people doing? They were doing something like this 10,000 years ago. They were recolonising the land as the last ice age shrunk back. They had a lifestyle quite similar to the Inuits of Greenland and so forth. It wasn't all ice flows, clearly, just as Greenland now has some land which is used, but it would have been a hunter-gathering lifestyle. Probably culturally and in terms of social culture and material culture, quite as complex as we associate with the Inuit Indians and so forth. There's no reason to suspect it was any less complex. It's just that the archaeology simply doesn't provide leather and fur and hide and so forth, bark. By the time they're building the henge, we've moved on from the Mesolithic into the Neolithic, but I think we still have this evidence for a very much waterborne transport. This is the primary way they moved around. Moving around overground would have been secondary. If you've got to take a lot of stuff with you, it's much easier to put it on some sort of boat. And I think this is based on some Minnesota Indians from right at the end of the 19th century. But it's the sort of lifestyle that I imagine the people who built Avebury henge, any other henge, and Neolithic monument, that same sort of sophistication, complexity. And if we think of how many Native American tribes there were when we made a colonial contact, again, that same complexity of culture. It wasn't just one Neolithic culture, it wasn't just one Native American tribe. If you're getting around in either the Mesolithic or the Neolithic, clearly there weren't maps. This is as good as it got in terms of maps. Now, I know there's been quite a bit of speculation that for argument's sake, cup and ring marks might be maps. They might be. I think there are probably arguments for several dozen other things that they might be as well. It's not quite the answer to the question. But they certainly did get around. And in the early Neolithic, they were trading polished hand axes. These are mostly examples from the Lake District, Langdondale. These happen to have been found in Leicestershire. But then there's another little axe factory in Leicestershire with examples found throughout Britain and so forth. But the Lake District ones are most common. In Avebury, there are examples of these that have been found. There's even a small fragment about this sort of size, but it is a broken fragment, which has definitely come up from the Lizard Peninsula down in Cornwall. That's the only place that particular type of rock is found. So they were definitely getting around, moving and I don't like the word trade, but something like that, exchanging valuable artifacts. If we want some other secondary evidence that they're getting around by boat, then look at the locations of some of the chamber tombs. These are early Neolithic. These are about 5,000 years ago, very similar in age to, say, West Kennet Long Barrow, the Cotswold 7 Long Barrows. But in this case, this one is Pembrokeshire, part of a group. And this one particularly dramatically on the coast here, and always was on the coast. This is not erosion. Clearly, two things are going on here. One is that when you bury Grandad, he's got a really good view of the waves and so forth. And you remember paddling in as a child and so forth. But what's more interesting, some research that was published about 7 or 8 years ago now, reveals that these are very good sea marks. When you're out in that estuary, there happens to be a rather significant sandbank just here, which, whilst you're not likely to run aground, would definitely change the tidal flow. So when you see that particular tomb, you know where you are in terms of getting about on the Pembrokeshire coast. More examples, I could give you a lot. Here we're in the Dumfries Galloway Peninsula of Scotland, and one of the Cairn Holy monuments. Sorry, this is a black and white photograph I took many years ago. A bit of oops, and we're actually looking, sea is there. But again, this one works as a very good sea mark. Again, the problem for getting around that peninsula is some very, very fast tidal rips and so forth. So you really need to know where you are and what's going on. The nearest analogy I can give now is to leap forward into the Anglo-Saxon period, just temporarily for a few slides, because one of the problems with dealing with prehistory is that you have no history, you have no written sources. At least with the Anglo-Saxons, they might not have left us everything written down themselves, but we are still speaking Anglo-Saxon words and names and so forth, particularly place names. This is at the Avenue at Avebury. I think many of you have spotted that. I'm not actually interested in the foreground. It's this that interests me. Have you spotted that one? That's Overton Hill. End of the Marlborough Downs, if you like. The sanctuary, if you want your locations, is just over there. And it is a very distinctive name. It is an over. And in Anglo-Saxon, that means very specifically a hill that's got a flat top and looks, if you like an upturned canoe. And that bottom end of the prow of the canoe is taking you down to the Kennet Valley down there. So if you know somewhere's called an Overton, you are looking for a particular shape of hill, a particular shape. You could actually go through the words in Old English, in the Anglo-Saxon language, for hill. I'm going to do it very quickly. I hope most of you can read that. But there's, a dozen roads names there. Some we recognise, like hill, don, down, and so forth. Ridge is obvious, edges. Each one is different. These are not different words for a hill. These are different shaped hills. And to an Old English speaker, they would have been distinctive. Over appears here. Hoe is an interesting one. It's heel-shaped. Plymouth Hoe, Houghton on the Hill, those sort of place names. Spelt various ways now. But imagine you're a very, very large giant, and you lie down on the landscape on your face, on your tummy, and your foot looks like that. There's your heel, and there's the ball of your toes. It's that shape which is a hoe. Very distinctive shape again. There are villages around that are called Houghton, often spelt Houghton. Leicestershire actually has a village called Hose, Hose. Nothing to do with stockings. There are two hoes there. That's what gives it its name, the plural, hose. Okay, you thought that was enough words for hill. No, there are more if you really want to get obsessed with this, including words for wooded hills and so forth. This is far more words than the Eskimos have allegedly got words for snow. But then Britain has got a lot of hills. You think that's enough? No, we've got names for valleys as well. I'll skip why I'm showing you a picture of the Danes' Bottom at Great Rollright, but there's that is a Dean, not a Dane. No Danes ever expose their bottoms in Rollright. It is a Dean that's become a bottom. The Celtic word is hrecht, which also refers to this thing, so it's Great Rollright is the original version of the name. And they've got words for woodland, including things, grove, graff, and woodoo, and frith, and so forth. Again, particularly interesting bit of woodland to me in Leicestershire. And they've got names for watery spaces, places like burns, brooks, fairly obvious. Well is what we would think of as a spring rather than a hole in the ground that you drop a bucket into. Meres and fleets. And interestingly, they borrow the Latin word fonta, which in Latin means font, and it becomes places like Urchfont and Mottisfont. Quite what it was describing, whether it was a well that fed into a cistern or something like that, not clear now, but borrowing all these different words. Why am I telling you this? Because if you actually look for these types of place name elements, they start popping up at you. This happens to be Leicestershire, which is where I was living for nearly 25 years before I moved to Avebury. And I actually, more by chance, realised that if you started south of Leicester, there's Leicester, at Great Glen, Glen is a valley, you could actually make your way up and over through the Glen, the settlement on the Roman road, the street, a Hoe, a Newton, it's obvious, Twyford, two fords, a borough, the earthwork, the Iron Age hill fort, Pickwell, the well on the peak, very unusual place to have a spring, well on the peak, quite distinctive. And Overton, there are quite a few around there, so this one's Cold Overton. Langham, the long settlement, the long home, the long harm. Barleythorpe, Thorpe means a daughter settlement, Barley means what it obviously means. And then as we follow through, not all these places are shown on this Google map. But Ashwell, that's obvious, isn't it? Barrow means exactly what it says. Tiny little village, takes its name from a prehistoric barrow. Another Overton, and over to Thistleton, almost on the Lincolnshire border. What it says, the settlement, Little Toon, where thistles grow, because it's actually on the site of a Roman town, quite a big Roman town with a Roman temple, where they were doing a heck of a lot of ironworking in the Iron Age and the Roman period. And thistles grow extremely well on disturbed ground, such as you get with ruined towns. Gloucestershire has and Wiltshire both have a Nettleton, exactly the same thing, both on Roman small towns. So we, in principle, have a very descriptive way of getting around at least part of East Leicestershire and Rutland. The problem is we've got to remember, however many names that is, in the right order. If we get the order wrong, we're going to get hopelessly lost. That isn't such a problem as it sounds. Because, of course, if you actually start to invent a little story that links those places together, I think you're leaping ahead of me here. We have the songlines of Australian Aboriginal culture and so forth, which obviously relate to narratives, to songs, to the dreaming tracks, can also be represented visually in various ways. And some of them are very specifically maps. This is a spear thrower, something that I would imagine is about 2 to 3 feet long in real life. And it is engraved with a stylized map. Now, don't worry with all the description. This is the anthropologist telling us exactly the names of the waterholes and places on that map. So you're travelling around, you've gone walkabouts, you're carrying your map in your hand with your spear thrower. Okay, it's a ceremonial object rather more than a practical object. But certainly one way of remembering and narrating those journeys. I suspect most of you are thinking of Songlines, the name of the book, name of the novel, which Bruce Chatwin published in the late 80s. There he is, when he's of course no longer with us. He died. A lot of people are very surprised when I refer to it as a novel, but that's exactly the way that Chatwin referred to it. It's a well-researched novel, but it is not a primary work of anthropological research. The person who is fictionalised as his key informant is just a fictionalised blending of several characters and so forth. But nevertheless, it gives us the gist and some useful quotations. It's certainly given the English language the word songlines. Native Australians would tend to use things like dreaming tracks and so forth. What happens if you actually forget the whole of the songline and you actually only remember small fragments of that overall narrative? Well, I'm suggesting you end up with the sort of place-specific folklore that people like Leslie Grinsell was collecting, in his case mostly about prehistoric sites, mounds and so forth, and which came together in the 1970s, was brought together in the 1970s by Janet and Colin Board, and produced really a whole shelf full of books along those lines, with this very specific, place-specific legends and lore, which seems not to have a wider reference. If it does, it's just simply because it mimics a similar story the next county or a few counties away. But those little stories could well have been, in some cases, not every case, part of a much bigger narrative that was a mnemonic that helped you remember which order things came in. Why do I say that? I say it with some conviction for two reasons. The better example, if you like, is the work of Alan Garner. Yes, that Alan Garner, who started with the Weird Stone of Brisagemin and is still writing fantasy novels now. He was born and brought up, as I suspect you know, in the Alderley Edge area of Cheshire. That's Alderley Edge. And at the beginning, in the frontispiece to the Weird Stone, is this map showing Alderley Edge and a variety of places, Stormy Point, Thieves' Hole and so forth, which are part of the opening legend of the man taking a mare to market in Mobberley and meeting the rather strange guy at the crossroads who says, "You will never sell that horse at Mobberley Market." "Oh yes, I will," says the farmer. Come dusk, he's not sold the horse, he comes back to Thieves' Hole and the crossroads, and that same weird guy is with him, and he says, "Come with me." And he follows him all the way to the iron gates, and if you know the story, the gates slam open, the side of the hill opens up, and there are the sleeping knights. And the weird old man says to the farmer, "Leave your horse here, but take as much gold as you can carry from that cave," which he does. Nobody ever opens the cave again. Lovely little story. It links together these places here. What Alan Garner has done in this little booklet, which came out about 3 or 4 years ago, is actually put his local historian hat on and actually look at that detailed information that we have from the place names, try and bring it all together, and he really sort of fleshes out that legend, not in the way that it appears in that story that came from his grandfather that is in print in the early 19th century, but actually brings that little area to life again and links those places together in this very, very clear narrative, this very clear story. So that's Stormy Point on Alderley Edge, and that is Leicestershire again. Sorry about this, I happen to know it quite well. This is the site of the castle at Mount Sorrel. This is a village just north of Leicester. And we go, and Leicester City is down here. There are about 5 or 6 other villages, Birstall, Wanlip, Rothley, what order they're in. I can't remember what order they come in, but I can just get down there, I'll be there. So we're looking from Mount Sorrel down south towards Leicester over here. It's slightly hidden by this tree. In the 19th century, not quite sure when, but it certainly appears in print towards the end of the 19th century, somebody came up with a little ditty that helps you remember what order those villages come in. It's not great poetry, you'll see it in a moment, but basically you have to imagine that you're either an old god called Bell or the old god's horse called Bell. It gets a bit confusing, but you're an incredibly powerful horse. And you're so good that Bell actually bets that the horse can get about 7 miles from Mount Sorrel to Leicester in just 5 leaps. And you're going, no way. Well, he did. Mount Sorrel he mounted at, Rothley he rode by, One Lip he leaped over, or o'er. At Birstall he burst his gall, or burst his all, the versions change, and at Belgrave he was buried. Okay, it's not epic poetry, it's not great poetry, but once you've got that little story in your mind, it does help you remember what order those villages come in. And it's that sort of thing, perhaps a little bit more elaborate, that I would suggest our Anglo-Saxon forebears thought about when they were trying to remember the Overton to the Thistleton to the Broadford to the Greenhill or whatever they were trying to remember, and would also have precedence, I think, at any time in the past, any traditional culture that was just trying to look at the landscape, look at how distinctive the shape of the hills and the trees and the valleys were, and make their way around. Right, that's probably enough Leicestershire for one talk in Glastonbury. Firmly back in Avebury. Yes, I've been going there since 1918, taking photographs on 6cm cameras, infrared sensitive film and pinhole cameras. I've done the lots, all strange colour film. And then digital cameras sort of make life a bit easier and so forth. And getting to know the place, particularly at dawn. I will say if you've been to Avebury, but you've not been there at dawn, on a sunny dawn, then you've really not explored Avebury. That is the most magical time to be there. These simulacra start to pop up at you. You turn around and there's another face looking at you, or more likely, as in this case, this is one of the surviving stones of the North Circle. I just call him the Dawn Watcher, because there he is, looking at the eastern entrance, looking at the rising sun. Go there at midday, even with the sun shining, and say, what face? There's not a face there, Bob. Oh, I can just about make it out. But go there at dawn, and he most definitely stands out, along with many others. But Avebury isn't just the henge, it is this whole collection of monuments from the Neolithic, early to late Neolithic, Silbury Hill being one of the later monuments. If my book, Seeing Up the Country, had one point of origin, it probably has 2 points of origin, but it is this particular book, rather significantly called The Story of Silbury Hill. And this is 2 very distinguished academics, professional archaeologists, perhaps you should say, Jim Leary and David Field, both working for English Heritage, in their various ways contributing to the excavations about 10 years ago after the hole developed in Silbury Hill, and they did a lot of restoration work. This is the short publication, relatively short publication of those excavations and results. And at one point they say that whatever the Neolithic people were doing while they were building Silbury Hill, what they were also doing was telling or retelling a very good story or a myth. It's almost certainly some sort of reenactment of probably a primordial myth. That's these 2 respected professional archaeologists, which is probably as far as they're ever going to venture into realms of mythology and so forth. But it immediately made me think in terms of some very specific primordial creation myths that are known the world around, which I'll be coming to. We already have a creation myth for Silbury Hill. Those of you know the writings of John Aubrey from the 17th century, will know that Silbury was raised while a posset of milk seethed. And I think a lot of people wonder what a posset is. Well, there's a visual clue, thanks to Google Images. Posset was a drink of hot milk curdled with ale and beer that was supposedly good for you. It was used as a remedy for colds and so forth, but clearly the milk was warmed up. So for where this story came from and how Aubrey acquired this story is completely lost to us, but it is an interesting story, given that we are on chalk uplands and all the water around Silbury, if you stir it up with the silt, will become a milky type of water very easily, very quickly. We can think of Silbury perhaps as a world mountain, as the sort of axis mundi, as having association or a substitute for something like a world tree. In the Scandinavian traditions, the world tree is Yggdrasil, variously an ash or a yew. One or two of the sagas from Scandinavian lore actually say that the roots of Yggdrasil is watered with white silt, which again gives us some direct relevance to Silbury. Is Silbury perhaps a replacement for a huge tree that inevitably eventually died? Did they rather optimistically think they were going to make a tree grow on the top of it? I don't think they would necessarily be that daft, but it might have been the idea. So Silbury becomes part of the creation myths of the Neolithic, or reenactment of these creation myths in some way or another. Can we be that vague? Well, Silbury is definitely a watery location, even if the moat doesn't flood very regularly these days. Certainly the Winterbourne, the Beckhampton stream and so forth are flowing around it. Swallowhead and the River Kennet is immediately to the south. We already have some narratives, some very rich mythic narratives for Silbury and Avebury, thanks to Michael Dames's work in the second half of the 1970s. For a different reason, Michael let me have a photograph of him at the time he published Silbury Treasure and Avebury Cycle in the 1976-77 period. I'm not sure it was a good thing for him to let me have it or not, but there you go, that's what he looked like at the time. People have kind of, and part of Michael's narrative, and I'm not going to repeat it here, it's a very complicated one, is clearly, in his case, seeing Silbury as the womb of a giant goddess, a prehistoric goddess, and linking in specifically with the August full moon. That is the full moon rise last August. It's not so much a creation myth, unless you think of, obviously, the goddess giving rebirth in those terms and so forth. Michael Dames's original ideas, I think, have sort of become accepted by a great many other people. They've sort of become part of the general way we think about Avebury. And I rather jokingly say, but Michael himself is largely been sort of overlooked and forgotten by many people, not everybody, I know. And it's almost as if his ideas have taken on a life of their own in the last 30 or so years. His ideas have become legendary in his own lifetime. The fact that he came up with them has largely been forgotten. We sort of live with the idea that the August full moon and Silbury are sort of really important, but we're never quite sure why. I'm actually going to take a different take to this. I'm not necessarily excluding other takes. I just want to sort of bring something new, something slightly different into the mix. And if we're talking watery locations, inevitably we're going to be talking about waterbirds and waterfowl. And the most dramatic of our waterfowl, of course, are swans and their near relations, geese. And I don't think necessarily traditional cultures separate too much between species as we do. Certainly if you talk to somebody in India, swan goose is really the sort of word that they have to describe large, generally white birds and so forth. Very dramatic. Just the sound of them, although interestingly the commonest species in the British Isles these days is the mute swan, that very rarely makes a honking noise, as opposed to the trumpeter or whooper swan, which is the same species but known by different names in different places, which clearly is distinctive because of the sound it makes. We refer to a gaggle of geese. Geese are notoriously noisy, both in flight and otherwise. You hear a skein of geese go overhead before you actually see them usually. And so forth. Now, I am standing on somebody else's shoulders here, somebody I think who's familiar with this particular podium as well over the years, and that's Andy Collins, devoted a book of his own a good few years ago to swans, to Cygnus, particularly the archaeoastronomy of the Cygnus constellation. Andy and I have had several good, I've obviously read his book, but had several chats sort of bouncing ideas backwards and forwards about the mythic significance of swans and so forth. So part of what I'm going to say borrows directly from Andy, and part is me sort of chipping away in the same area and coming up with other ideas. Andy identified that swans are significant as long ago as 1,500 years ago. These are stylized swans as pendants, or this is one of several stylized swan pendants from the Siberia area. They're carved in mammoth ivory. So clearly swans have been significant for a very long time. At that time, the Cygnus constellation was almost circumpolar. It was seen in the northern hemisphere all the time, not just occasionally, as it is in recent millennia. They are dramatic birds when they're flying overhead. They often fly by night. They migrate by night. The mute swan in Britain doesn't migrate very much. In other parts of Europe, the mute swan migrates, and the trumpeter and whoopiter swans are also, and the other species also migrate fairly extensively. They travel north, south, usually passing through the British Isles about sort of November, February time, which may or may not be significant. And they carry their young like this. Wonderful photograph I just bumped into on the BBC News site about a month ago. It's lovely. What Andy starts to develop, and what I think is a very interesting part of this, is that swans enter mythology in a number of ways. In Germanic mythology, we think of things like swan maidens as perhaps a synonym for the Valkyries. That's probably wrong. It probably tells us more about 18th, 19th century German mythologists than it does about the origins of the word swan maiden and Valkyrie. But swan maidens associated with death. Swans as these noisy birds migrating northwards by night. I've come up with the fairly strong belief that people were thinking of swans as psychopomps, otherworldly birds, travelling north beyond the north wind, taking the souls of the dead to their final resting place. Or is it the final resting place? Is it just a temporary resting place before the spring migration, when they bring the souls of the yet-to-be-born children back from this winter place? So they're seen as a two-way journey, the souls travelling with the swans northwards, but also coming back again with the southward migration. And images like that, which would have been familiar to the Neolithic, I think perhaps start to feed into that. So imagine you just hear swans or geese flying over by a rather dark night. It's difficult to show you a photograph of geese and swans flying in the dark, so you've got to bear with me on this one. But this otherworldly sound of the honking going over the sky, and that is taking, it's almost the wild hunt, except it's not dogs barking and so forth. A whole load of associations. We still think of babies being brought to, well, my generation anyway, we were told that babies were brought by storks and so forth. Okay, stork is not a swan, but in Germany it is actually the swan that is the bird that brings young babies, not the stork, which is not indigenous to the British Isles and never has been. We also have German expressions which translate. We would say, somebody's just walked over my grave, and we get a sudden shiver and goosebumps. The German expression translates roughly as, I can't say somebody has just goosed me because that means something else in English, but there's the problem of trying to translate from one language to another. I've been goosed sensation is what the German expression literally translates as, although it is not, has all the wrong associations. So when you get goosebumps and literally goosebumps, it's all that sort of territory. So swans, geese, other worlds, ghosts and so forth, I think, are part of it. And that is where I think places like Silbury, the other watery locations around Avebury, are feature, because you see swans appearing around on the lake around Silbury and so forth, early November, early February on the return migration, dates which are still significant to modern paganism and going back certainly a long time. Just going to speculate slightly. This is a Google Earth view. There's Silbury with the moat that's, Michael Dame says, looks like a pregnant goddess. This is Swallowhead Springs. This wiggle is the Winterbourne. Those stepping stones that I showed you right at the beginning are there. And this then is the River Kennet flowing off to join the River Thames and so forth. That's looking from the stepping stones up to Swallowhead Springs. This is taken just over a year ago when there was water. There's no water been flowing. Wasn't 10 days ago, unless anybody's been more recently. That's where we were. So the water is flowing down here from there and flowing eastwards. This is just east of the footpath to West Kennet Long Barrow. Silbaby, if it means anything to you, is just here. and so forth, deliberately taken this photograph looking into the sun about 9 o'clock in the morning in the east. That's a bit further east still. This is the village of West Overton, looking with the water in with this very distinctive. It's a relative of the buttercup that lives in water and is what white flowers are ranuncular, but distinctive for chalkland streams and so forth. So definitely water around. I would suggest that if you're raising cattle and sheep and goats and other livestock, as we definitely are in the Neolithic, on chalk, you need a reliable source of water through the summer when your animals are there. The winterbourne says it all, it dries out. As we've seen most summers, the kennet dries out. There's Silbury and so forth, where the land sort of narrows down quite a bit. There's actually some little cliffs here, about 5 foot high, which are to do with changing the hardness of the chalk. I would argue that it would only take a very industrious beaver, a beaver colony, to create a little dam here, and you end up with essentially an artificial lake. Certainly some of these fields have been used as water meadows in recent centuries. What the beavers do, you could easily enhance. It would mean that there was permanent supply of water for quite a large number of livestock and so forth in this area. I can't prove that. Environmental archaeology might prove me wrong, but I think somewhere in this area there had to be a reliable source of water, a pond of water for the livestock. Otherwise you'd have an awful lot of dead livestock. What's interesting with this particular area is that these huge wooden palisades, the palisaded enclosures, partially excavated in the 1990s, they overlie this part of the valley as well. If there was water here and perhaps more water over here, you've got a similar situation to what's being excavated at the moment up on Orkney, the Ring of Brodka and Stones of Stenes, and this huge Neolithic temple site, stone built in this case, on the bit of headland in between. Again, there are parallels, roughly the right period and so forth. So that's my thoughts about how swans might fit into this area. Again, reinforcing the importance of water. Going back to that initial comment that people would have travelled around by water much more easily than they'll travel around overland, trying to fight their way through forests and so forth, dense woodland. Just a little secondary support as to why we might think of our soul as still being a little bit like a swan. That is, you might want to call it an angel, but it's people who carved it in the 18th century. That was a spiritus. It was the soul of the deceased. That is part of one of two of a rather sophisticated 18th century war monument at Tockenham in Wiltshire. I need to have gone that far because there's an equally good example in the parish church at Avebury. And actually, if you start going into parish churches and looking for these war monuments of that period, then they pop up very, very frequently indeed. They also pop up on tombstones. Most tombstones don't survive from the early 18th century. Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire has a particular type of slate which effectively doesn't weather. So we see these little angels, as people want to call them, because this is associated with the Vale of Belvoir on the Leicestershire-Nottinghamshire border. They're known locally as beaver angels. It's wrong. They actually extend for 40, 50 miles south of there into Northamptonshire, and they're not angels. They are actually the spiritus. Easy mistake to make and so forth. But again, these really flourish around the 1730s. This is the sort of the folksy, affordable version of the posh stonemason art that only the gentry could afford. But lovely motif. You know, Grandad wanted one on his gravestone, so well, that's the best we could do, get the local stonemason to carve one. But there are lots of these around, and they are, I think, following through this idea that the soul is in the head. We still think of our consciousness as being in our head. We still think that our brains are where our soul, is associated with our self-identity. If you actually think about it, we've got far more nerves and neurons and synapses and so forth. It's only the anatomist who chops our spinal cord after death and reveals a brain that's not continuous with all the other nerve stuff that carries on through the rest of our body. Actually, our thinking processes start throughout our bodies. And some of the processing is done only in our top part of our brain, but the limbic system, the lower brain, is deeply connected through the rest of our body. It's a function of anatomy that creates a brain that is separate from spinal column. And so we still think of our thinking and everything, our memory process is going on in our heads. It's a continuation of this belief system. It's not as real as we think it is. It's perhaps the best way to leave that thought. If I'm right, if Neolithic people did see souls being taken by whatever animals, it doesn't have to be swans, or by whatever psychopomps, to another world, to a permanent resting place, or to an intermediate resting place before they were reborn as the next generation, then one possibility, I sort of flying kites a bit here, but is that these souls rest in the stones of the henges. Not just Avebury, but any other Stonehenge as well. Stone-built henge, monument, stone circle. Clearly Mike Parker Pearson has made a bit of a career of popping up on television every time Stonehenge is mentioned and saying Stonehenge is a place of the dead, Dorrington Walls and Woodhenge are a place of the living. It's a bit simplistic. I think Mike's, if given a chance, would probably explain it in more detail, but that's the sort of soundbite for TV sort of aspect of it. If he is right, Stonehenge is a place of the dead, then it would mean that Avebury is also a place of the dead. But I refuse to think of them as some sort of dead zone. I think if the souls and spirits are in these stones and all these simulacra, and this is seen from the sunny side, this is as good a set of simulacra as there are anywhere in Avebury Henge. If there are souls in these stones, then this is a place that is alive, but alive with other than human persons, the souls and so forth, and we should approach it at that level. The slenderest of clues that I have is that for all the Neolithic activity, for quite a bit of Bronze Age activity, all the burial mounds that pop up on the skyline around Avebury, and of course elsewhere, but in this area and so forth. Clearly abundant archaeology, but there is no Iron Age archaeology. The Romans were around again later. And you can say, oh, well, they've just not looked hard enough. No, in this case, with the Avebury area, they've looked hard enough. In this case, absence of evidence, I think, is just about evidence of absence. The Iron Age people weren't here. This is the most warrior-dominated society that history had seen up to that point, or the society had seen up to that point, and they were afraid to come to Avebury. It wasn't something physical they were afraid of. They must have associated, and look at these henge banks. They're outside the ditch. They're not defensive. I think most of us know this. The one thing about a henge is the bank is outside. It can't be defensive. It's keeping something in. It could be pragmatic. It could be animals, cattle, whatever. Or it could be keeping the souls in. And I think how we still put walls around churchyards. Where there is a gap, the gate in, we want to put a nice, fairly fancy lich gate and so forth. We want to control the boundaries of where the dead are. And I don't think much has changed since the Neolithic. I think we should see the henge as primarily a place alive with the souls of the dead, a place of the dead if you like, but not a dead zone. And the banks are there, for, among other reasons. This is not an exclusive reason. This is another way of adding to how we think of it, that this is a place that is alive, but is a bit ooh. And by the time the myths have sort of got a bit simplified and degenerated in the Iron Age, it's like, you don't go there. That's just for the dead. You keep away from there. You can go up to Barbury Castle for the hill fort, huge Iron Age hill fort, just to the north. You can go towards Cherwell direction, Oldbury hill fort, but there's a gap in the chain of hill forts along the ridgeway, roughly where Avebury is, and so forth, Firefield Down area. It's as if, we're fine, we don't mind having our power centres there, but we ain't messing with Avebury. That's the sort of message you get about the Iron Age. The only reasonable explanation is that there's a myth going on here. There is something taboo about this area in the Iron Age. Can't elaborate any more than that. But souls, I think, would be one very good explanation. Clearly, I'm just touching on a whole number of issues which I expand in more detail in the book. Clearly, I can give you about half a chapter's worth of a book in the time of a talk like this. What I'm just going to very quickly work through is the extent to which rivers actually feature in a deeper level of thinking in the Neolithic. And this is real speculation. So I devoted a separate chapter in Seeing Up the Country to this, and I'm still working on a much longer version of this, pretty much, not today obviously, but otherwise as we speak. If your life is made up of travelling up and down rivers, the whole idea that life is a journey, that lovely little metaphor that most cultures have. Rivers can be seen as a metaphor of life. Yeah, of course, yeah, it's fairly obvious. No, it's a bit deeper. Here we're looking at the Winterbourne in just over a year ago, there's Silbury. So it's flowing down towards the junction with Swallowhead and to form the Kennet. Just to the west of Avebury Henge, this is the Winterbourne flowing. I've just turned around about 180 degrees and walked 100 yards, so Silbury's that away. This is the Winterbourne. This is a ditch otherwise known either as the Horselet Brook or sometimes as the Sambourne. Now, on thin ice, but the Sambourne possibly means the Summerbourne as opposed to the Winterbourne. It's a little bit, the early forms are not necessarily convincing, but again, something that could be ponded up to provide water for livestock. But I actually think rivers become like a metaphor, not just for life, but for the whole of creation. Why do I say that? Let's go back 2,500 years, or just a little bit more, to Chinese culture, fully fledged Chinese culture. Nothing start-up about this. This is a culture that's already been flourishing for 500 to 1,000 years. From the Tao Te Ching, the writings attributed to Lao Tzu, the great flow flows, the great Tao flows everywhere. The way flows everywhere. Here's Heraclitus, writing almost exactly the same time. We think of him as Greek. He was actually living on the eastern end of the Mediterranean, what is now the western coast of Turkey, the Ionian Sea. It was a trading port called Ephesus, just up the road from an even more important trading port called Miletus, which was also the home of early philosophers. Ideas are just swimming around that side of the Mediterranean in about 500 BC. They're coming overland from the trade routes out of North India and China, masses and masses of ideas, and they're hitting Greek people who are by and large writing them down for the first time, certainly writing down for the first time within Europe and so forth. So Heraclitus, interestingly, is almost using exactly the same language that Lao Tzu is using in the Tao Te Ching. There's this idea of dualisms, dialectic processes, having and not having arise together. What we later would want to call Yin-Yang, but Yin-Yang hasn't been invented yet. Lao Tzu doesn't use that language. He's just trying to describe this process of two things that are actually part of a greater whole and so forth. You know, we can't have fronts without backs. There's some greater entity and so forth. Heraclitus struggling in the same direction, you know, two different directions which harmonise with themselves, opposite tensions like that of a bow and a lyre. You know, you can only have a bow if you've got the tension in the string, which is the tension in the wood. What's Lao Tzu doing? He's referring to the bending of the bow, and the string's too short and so forth. Exactly the same metaphor from clearly several thousand miles apart, but I think probably shared through somewhere in the middle. There are very well-established trade routes even by 500 BC. So, what are we doing? Well, I think that whole sense of flow and process, I think clearly is present in both early Greek culture and Chinese culture 2,500 years ago. I think just gives us a clue that the early worldview, before the later Greek philosophers get hold of this and sort of set it all up with sort of Aristotelian logic and all these sort of things, but the earlier view is a much more, I'm literally going to say a fluid view, something that sees the whole of creation as a process, as a way, as the Tao, if you're Chinese. If you're Heraclitus, you just refer to flow, to flux is actually his preferred word. The parallels between these two writers, very, very great indeed. I don't think they're sort of parallel evolution. I think they're sharing something from somewhere in the middle that goes back even further, but clearly for which we have no written records. So that's the subject of the next bit of writing, really. So we're dealing with people coming up the river system from the Thames Valley. I try and weave everything together in Singing Up the Country, all these disparate ideas. In the final chapter, I get a bit experimental. I imagine that there's a grandmother and a granddaughter setting off in one of those birch bark canoes from somewhere around the Thames estuary and coming up this river system to stop roughly at that lake, I speculate, for near Silbury and so forth. They're coming up that journey. And as they come up that journey, and the grandmother is telling her young granddaughter some of the legends that link together the places on this river system. Frustratingly, I had far too many ideas to fill a chapter, and it's more of a potted version of that. I call it a Kennet dreaming. Again, I'm making a direct allusion back to the Australian traditions of songlines and dreaming tracks and so forth. I'm certainly not proposing to stand here and read you pages from a book. I have to drop that teaser and say, you got to buy the book to read it, and how it all weaves together. As a sweetener, it's a book that normally costs $14.95, and if you find me in the dungeon down here, the far end of the dungeon, the basement, today I'm selling it for £10, so you've got really no excuse not to get your own copy. Trying to weave all these ideas together, not as a bunch of facts, but actually to put them into the mouth of a grandmother teaching a youngish granddaughter. I hadn't seen that photograph from the Minnesota Indians when I wrote that chapter. I only found this photograph on the internet about 6 or 8 weeks ago. But if I had have seen that photograph, I'm afraid it would have strongly coloured how I thought of the material culture of that couple of people and so forth. All the parallels are there. Native American Indians, at the point of contact with the colonial forces and so forth, are living, give or take a bit of native copper, they're living a Stone Age lifestyle, but a very sophisticated lifestyle, as we're well aware. So, at this point, I would say, do I know the stories of my adopted home in Avebury? And I think the short answer is no, but I'll make a jolly good attempt at trying to come up with some good stories that are, if they're not probably true, at least plausible, that the evidence fits them. And I think what I'm hoping to do, and the subtitle is Songlines of Avebury and Beyond, is really to give you some clues to go away and think about your own landscape, the Anglo-Saxon place names, the Neolithic sites, sacred sites, wherever you are, and actually start to see them not as isolated sites, but as stories, or sites which are linked together by stories, and always were. Yeah, blow the dust off Janet and Colin Board books or whatever it takes, and try and bring those sites back together as part of a narrative, as part of a story. And that is the point at which I hope I've still left a little bit of time to take questions. Can you correct me, Hugh, if I'm wrong? I thought I was doing about right. Okay. I've not completely numbed all your brains. What's the procedure, Hugh? Do you wander around with a microphone, or we just invite questions from the floor? I'm struggling to see. If there are no questions, I'm entirely happy, but there's two.
Stretch that far. Repeat the questions, Mike.
I'd just like to actually say something rather than question. Regarding the swans, in ancient India and Sanskrit, you've probably heard the name Paramahansa,
Yeah.
which actually means a swan-like man.
Right.
And the swan is revered in India because it's a bird that if you give it a muddy pool and you put milk in, then it can just take the milk from the pool. So saints were considered swan-like for the same reason. In the material world, they can just take what is the nectar, the spiritual.
Soma.
So that's the reverence
Thank
that
you.
the swan held in India.
Yes, I mean, I was aware, and I think Andy Collins had made me aware, I think, but more accurately, of the Indian deity Hansa, who is a swan god. But I wasn't aware of the story about the milk. And anything to do with milk just immediately gets me going, because clearly the water around the Silbury area on the chalk, once you stir the silt up, quickly becomes milky. I mean, I don't think you would mistake it for real milk. And this whole thing about John Aubrey and the posset of milk seeding, just a tentative clue that almost tells a story but doesn't. Thank you.
Oh, there's a question here. Excuse me, there's a question here.
Oh, hi. Just a a very brief question. I wonder if you found anything about bees or honey in the mythology and stories connected with Avebury.
I'm sad to say I haven't, but then again, I haven't been looking either. I'm sure if I put my mind to it, I'd delve into that one and say, I should have said that there was so-so. But right off the top of my head, no, I just haven't looked specifically for bees and honey. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to say they're not present. It's just not what I've been looking for.
Question here.
Yeah.
In the period you've been talking about, beavers were active.
Very much
Beavers
so.
would have built dams down rivers like the Kennet, which would produce a pooling effect.
Yeah.
And light little boats, like canoes, whatever, dugouts, could be dragged up past them. And it would be a convenience to have those little dams all the way down the river.
Yes, I mean, my understanding is that beavers were not extinct in Britain, and I assume that includes England, until the 14th century. How well that is dated, I really haven't delved into. If there's likely to be a surviving beaver colony, I suspect Wiltshire is one of those sort of places that they're likely to be late survivors. Certainly every suggestion they'd be around in the Neolithic period and so forth. And yes, the pools would be so useful. Yeah, they just trap, a number of levels.
2, 1, 2. We have a radio mic.
I just wanted to make a comment about the rivers, and I'm reminded of Anthony Murphy in this very room, the first or second megalithomania, talking about the River Boyne in Ireland that flows past Newgrange, and linking it with some of the work Robert Boval had done about the Nile, the as above, so below ideas that, and particularly, and I'm really struck by your idea of the east-west flowing rivers. Of course, the Nile goes north-south, but certainly for the Boyne, that it would mirror the Milky Way. And, Anthony Murphy showed, and I've, gone back to that bit of Ireland to have a look since I come from near there, the markers at which they would see Venus and the moon, and of course the sun, rising over the east, over the Irish Sea. And then the river would become your mythical link with the heavens. Yeah. And I wondered if the Kennet could well have done that. And it wasn't so much, it was more a magical space rather than, or in addition to, something that you actually travelled up. Talking of which, I wouldn't fancy having to canoe all the way from Berkshire upstream. Jolly hard work against the flow. But I presume maybe
it's a lot easier than going through the Savernake Forest, which was...
Well, really, okay, fair.
Yeah, which would have tracks, but yeah. Yes, I do. The part of the book which I don't touch on in this talk is the interest in bulls and cattle, significance of bulls and cattle, which is, I think, fairly well known for Avebury. The cove with its third stone can be thought of as a bull. West Kennet has been, Chamber Tomb has been interpreted as a bull's head. A number of the Bucraner cattle skulls and so forth in key contexts, I think, is very, very significant there and elsewhere. So yeah, bulls are significant. The bend of the Boyne, I think, it has a possible bull's horn shape loop in the river. I'm also well aware of. I'm aware a number of people have looked very closely at the Irish material and so forth. I've probably read some of their work, most of their work perhaps over the years, but I've always wanted to concentrate on the places that I know best, places I'm living in, which was Leicestershire, obviously now Avebury, and just focus on where I know and just benefit from the research of other people without necessarily getting deeply involved in what was going on the Boyne. But there have to be parallels. If I'm making projections and suggestions about what's happening in the Neolithic for the Avebury area, they have to match in some way what's happening in the Neolithic in Ireland or in western Spain, northern France, the Atlantic coast and so forth. You can't have something going in one place that's completely contrary to what's going elsewhere. How are we doing here?
Just one more question. This gentleman here.
Hello. Besides the Saxon words for Britain's landscapes, have you researched the Cymric Brittonic words for Britain's landscapes as well?
I personally haven't. Clearly, the advantage we have for the Old English words is that they've been researched for much longer, for more decades. The Celtic Brittonic place name studies has been going for 20 to 30 years and is just beginning to get really interesting. But it isn't quite as advanced. Again, it's an area which I sort of look over the shoulders and read some of the very erudite academic works and so forth, that information about the origin of the name Great Rollright and so forth is pretty dense stuff. Again, here looking for Celtic place name elements within Britain rather than in Scotland, Wales or Ireland where you'd expect to find them. So yeah, there is a lot of work going on. I would have to say that I think the scholarship is just, it's getting there, but it's not quite as fully fleshed out as the Old English scholarship. So I'm looking forward to more things. What strikes me when you look at Celtic, I'm going to call Celtic place name studies and so forth, is that these descriptive parts are usually much more obvious even in modern day Celtic languages, Gaelic or whatever. Whereas the way they've been spelt and misspelt over the last 1,000 or so years in English, we sort of lose the significance of what an over is or an overton is, or a hoton is. It's lost to us, whereas in Celtic, if you speak that language, many of those place names, if they've not been corrupted, are still fairly obvious. So it's a bit like driving in sort of parts of America or Australia, where you can come to villages named after, or settlements and towns named after people or objects and so forth, which still literally mean what they mean in modern English, and that's a sort of even more extreme version. The Old English versions are just lost to us through the haze of language, the evolution of the English language. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.